Hello and welcome to today's live webinar. RETEC is proud to host industry guests to share insights on topics related to global health authorities and related regulations and requirements. We're thrilled to host today's panelists. We have Dr. Basil Akra of the Akra team, a globally acting consultancy company, and Lisa Van Ryn, a guru with Greenlight Guru, who helps companies establish state-of-the-art quality management systems. Our moderator today is Gary Sainer, Senior Manager of Information Solutions at RETEC. I'm Angela Alexandro, Head of Marketing at RETEC. Today, our panelists are going to discuss insights into the MDR, IVDR, QMS scenario, also nonconformities and special scenarios. Today's news on the amendment pushing forward will definitely be a topic we'll talk about as well. As always, links to the recording and the slides will be emailed to all registrants within the next business day or so. And with that, I'm going to turn the agenda over to Mr. Gary Sainer to take us through today's discussion.
Well, thank you very much, Angela, and welcome everyone in the audience, and a special welcome to Basil and Lisa to be able to join us today. We'll work our way through some of the topics here regarding the conformity assessment and hopefully give you some actionable items in making sure that is all complete at your particular site. We're going to spend a lot of time doing kind of a live Q&A. So not too much presentation with the fixed slides. I'm going to go through a couple in the beginning just to set the context, and then we'll have a panel discussion with Basil and Lisa. And then if you see on the screen here, audience questions, and then we're going to have audience questions. And then when that's done, we're going to have audience questions. So I think you get the idea. We really want to hear your questions. Feel free to make use of that chat, send it in, and we'll keep this a very live, interactive type of discussion today. So to get things going, I want to talk a little bit about the context of this quality management system and how it fits into the overall conformity assessment framework. This is one slide that focuses in on the MDR. There's a similar parallel type of set of requirements and setups for various classes for the in vitro diagnostics. But when you look down at all the things that need to be done, there's a lot of technical documents, there's some other consultations, there's clinical evaluations, there's declaration of conformity. And by the way, circled in red there is a quality management system to put in play, all to be reviewed by the notified body in your conformity assessment. That is a pretty huge task, and we don't have time to talk about everything on that screen. But we're going to focus in on the quality management systems. We have some experts, certainly with Greenlight Guru, providing that particular product. So we're going to work our way through the quality management topic. One thing that we want to understand is the timing. Normally, you would think, okay, well, I have to get this review done, the quality conformity assessment completed before I go to market, obviously. I need to engage my notified body and so on, and have that on play right before I go to the market and place my products on the market. Well, there's a little bit of twist to that particular schedule now, and let's take a look at that. First, we'll talk about medical devices. The medical device regulation has provisions to extend the life of your legacy products. That these were the products that had a directive certificate, and they can be extended well, for the class 3s and 2B implantables all the way out to the end of 2027, and then another year for the class 2A and Bs and the 1 sterile measuring and reusable surgical items. But that doesn't come for free. There are some deadlines, some milestones that must be met. And this is to encourage manufacturers to engage in the notified, first of all, engage a notified body and to get working and set things up, and not to put it back on the shelf. So the extension, was to allow the workload to be handled by the notified bodies, not for manufacturers to push this project back on the shelf and not do anything for a couple more years. So the way the commission encouraged manufacturers to be involved is they put some milestones in place. So to enjoy the extra long extended life of these legacy devices, there are some milestones. And the first one is coming up in a month. So the timing is really good for us to be talking about this. Hopefully you've made good progress in meeting these requirements. In May of 2024, again, just a month or so away, there is a requirement that you applied for a notified body MDR assessment and have your quality management system in place in a month. So everything should be in play and should be making final adjustments to that. And then in September of this year, that particular agreement with your notified body has to be executed and signed off, ready to go. So once you have that in place, you're then able to meet the requirements criteria. There's some other criteria that's not the only thing, but no significant changes and some other ones. But anyway, you're able to change the extended life, enjoy the extended life of those implantables. We only bring that up because QMS is one of the criteria to have in play. Now, if we just take a moment and move over to in vitro diagnostics, there's a similar discussion, but the timing is different. Yeah, go ahead.
Perhaps let me just interrupt shortly just to make sure, because there is here in the graphical overview perhaps could be leading to misunderstanding. The deadline for, so there is no extension of certificate. What is extended is actually the ability to place devices on the market, and which is given by manufacturer declaration based on conditions which need to be met, which are connected especially to quality management system, post-market obligation, vigilance requirement, commitment to MDR, management of changes. And the deadline is actually 31st of December 2027 for class 3 on 2B, and 31st of December 2028 for the remaining 2A and class 1 devices. Perhaps from the graphical presentation here, it might be confusing. There is no 2029 deadline for those classes. This is just to make it clear for the listener to avoid actually that they are confused with that 2029 deadline. This is much more connected to actually, so after that, you have to be MDR compliant as a manufacturer, and this is just your ability to make use of additional time. But everything is described clearly in the 2023-607 amendment regulation. And if you look to the website of the European Commission and you look to Article 120, you can extract out of that clarity with regard to the clear timelines.
Yeah, very good. Thank you for that clarification. This December 31st, 2027, when I put that on my calendar, it looks like the beginning of 2028, but it's really one day before the end of, or one day prior to the beginning of 2028. So yeah, it looks like it goes into 2028, but that's not the case. It's actually the last day of 2027. But thank you for that clarification. This needs to be met, and by that point in time, you should have been migrating products over to the medical device regulation. Let's move over to the in vitro diagnostics now, and a similar conversation, but the dates are a little bit different. Yes, I know it's getting a little busy here on the screen. The date of application for the IVDR now 2022, and these particular dates have been recently extended. And actually, I did want to let everyone know that there was some activity. There was a proposal to move these dates as shown on the screen here. And Basil, I think you had an update. Even today, I think there was some news coming from the Parliament. Could you give us an update there?
Yes, so today there was the voting of the Parliament, and the Parliament voted in favor of that actually amendment to the legislation again. The focus of that amendment is related to 3 points. The first point is a timeline for actually the transitional provision of the IVD regulation, which are reflected with your presentation here to give those manufacturers additional time in consistency with the MDR to allow manufacturers as well to have additional time to work on certification under the IVD regulation with the support of notified bodies. So we are not referring to devices who are not requiring a notified body interaction and support. And then we will be looking also towards getting a new implementation timeline for EUDAMED, especially with regard to the registration models, because legislators are looking for more transparency, and EUDAMED, as you know, as of today, wasn't enforced officially by law. It was actually a voluntary implementation so far because the 6 models are not done on time, and one of the model is still delayed, which means that we need to have transparency. We don't have an obligation yet on EUDAMED. Therefore, it will be now a rollout of EUDAMED in a modular way, which ensure that actually manufacturer registration, product registration is done timely. So you need to watch it. You need to make sure that your EUDAMED process, so going back to quality management system, one of the key points is actually you need to establish your EUDAMED processes, train your team, and make sure that the interaction with EUDAMED is actually up and running. Because when the legislation, which is now voted to be positively accepted by Parliament, go to the Council, and the Council will accept it as well, it will be published in the official journal, and from then you have actually an official amendment to the regulation, which is going to be impacting your compliance if you don't meet it on time, as is stipulated in the regulation itself. Then the third point of that amendment is related to also a key element where the European legislator want to be actually proactive and protective to the healthcare system in the EU, and they are requiring an amendment to the Article 10. Article 10, to remember everyone, are manufacturer obligations, and they are adding actually a sub-bullet below that, which is actually talking about proactive communication about critical devices, certain critical devices, and if there is like a projection from a manufacturer point of view that those devices will not be available within the next 6 months on the market because of whatever reason, they need to proactively inform their competent authorities. And this is like an additional process which you need to establish an organization, have the dedicated people develop that. And this is always going back to the process, what you just mentioned, but we're going to have more conversation about that during this session today.
Yeah, thanks for that update. So these particular dates that were proposed are now passed, and we'll see the official publication of those. The second point about EUDAMED being gradually rolled out, actually that's a good commercial for our part 3 of this series. We're doing a 3-part series. This is actually part 2 of that particular group. And the third part, we'll focus in on UDI requirements into EUDAMED. So the timing of that registration was definitely affected by this particular vote that just happened today. But today we're talking about the quality management system. So the other point that I wanted to make here before we leave this screen was just like the medical devices had some criteria and related to various items, one of which includes the quality management system. The in vitro diagnostic also has a set of criteria. So there is a paired set, again, engaging a notified body and having it signed in September. And it comes in 3 waves. The first wave would be for those Class D products. Second wave would be Class C. And then the third wave would be for the Class B and the A sterile. So it kind of, well, it is corresponding to these particular groupings that are established here in the second row in our particular graphic here. Now, the other thing that comes to mind, and again, for today, the in vitro diagnostic compliant QMS needs to be in place on May of 2025. So it's a year later than what we just talked about earlier about the QMS being in play in May of 2024. So that kind of sets the groundwork. I don't want to spend too much more time on that. We have a lot of good questions to get into, but we have timing and some requirements that I implore you to make sure you meet those deadlines. Otherwise, you won't be able to gauge the extension of the legacy products to being able to place them on the market. Okay, with that said, let's move over to some questions that we have prepared for the panel, and then we're going to open up after that particular section to your questions that come in live. So again, go ahead, send them in at any point in time. We'll start off with this question, and Basil and Lisa both jump in here. Let's start with the first one regarding best practices. So let's talk first of all about some best practices. Prepare the QMS for MDR conformity assessment. And let's go with the scenario where it's a new company and there's no precedent in place, there's no legacy QMS system. What is the good practices that need to be followed for MDR? And then we're going to come back and talk about in vitro diagnostic compliant QMS as well. But what are your comments there about setting up QMS for MDR, brand new company?
So I think it's important to first establish a plan, and using the 1345 standard, of course, as a baseline. It's really a checklist. Walk through each of the stages, make sure that you have the appropriate documentation in place that answers questions about non-application and provides rationale for anything that you're scoping out of your QMS, and that your procedures and work instructions address how you are going to execute each of the stages of the standard.
Yeah, so I think what Lisa mentioned is very important. One key element which is important is a plan. So building a system needs to have a plan, and the plan doesn't mean a one plan fits all, because every single organization has a different structure, has different plans, which means I might be a new company who's delegating a lot of activities to my suppliers, and I can be a company who's doing everything in-house. So you need to look on what is actually happening with your organization, what is the structure that you're going to have long-term. And then you need to read the applicable regulation, because the standard is nothing else than a recipe which help you to meet the requirement. Is not actually a requirement which you need to meet unless you make it as a requirement, as a methodology to fulfill the requirement. The MDR and the IVDR tell you actually what are the requirements that you have to fulfill as a legal manufacturer. And if you look to Article 10 and you read the regulation, you're going to identify for your type of device, for your risk class, what kind of processes you would need. Then you can make use of the standards such as the ISO 13485, which is already also harmonized. So you can go on the harmonization list of the European Journal, and you will find that standard. And if you download the harmonized standard of ISO 13485, you will identify in Annex Z what are actually the requirement of the MDR or the IVDR, which can be met by the ISO. And then you're going to see that there are some gaps, and those gaps you need to address them separately. And this will be part of your planning at the very early stage. And now, if you are a new company, you have to do everything from scratch. If you are an established company, do me a favor, don't be so arrogant, because you are not established for the MDR and the IVDR. So even if you have a running quality management system, which is audited every year, the legislation introduced additional obligation. You need to identify those obligations. You need to see, am I meeting them, or do I need to create new processes, new templates, a new training material to address those requirements? And then you need to check the effectiveness of what you have done before someone will come and audit you. So all of these aspects are very important, ensuring that you are in compliance. Because a lot of people will tell me today, like you mentioned, Gary, before, oh, we are ready for the MDR, we are meeting the provision of actually having an ability to keep placing devices on the market because you have a quality management system which is MDR ready. Then I ask them, how do you know that? They say, like, because we have been always audited. I ask them, have you been audited to MDR? No, but we have a quality management system certificate 13485, which means we are compliant. It's like, no, it's not, because 13485 is not the MDR and not the IVDR. So you need to look to that gap, and Annex Z would help you actually understanding what are the additional obligations which you need to fulfill.
Yeah, I think that's great. And doing an audit before you get to that notified body assessment on top of your gap assessments that you need to fill. And also it's important to note that once you stand your QMS up, you need to exercise it. So you should have had a management review. You should have had some nonconformities identified in your system so that when the formal audit does occur, that there is evidence that you are actually using the QMS. So just having a CAPA procedure doesn't mean a whole lot if you don't show that the process is working.
So I did have a follow-up question on that. If let's say I'm a new company and I embark on setting up some kind of a homebrew system. I know, Lisa, you provide that Greenlight Guru system, and does a wonderful job. But have you heard of some companies that try to do this on their own and build their own quality management system? And what happens when that gets put together?
I guess it depends on how they put it together. But whatever they might need to do, validating the effectiveness of that software, assessing that for risks, because you do need to document changes. You do need to have traceability and history of what activities are occurring in the system. And so trying to build your own paper system or electronic system using spreadsheets or some other sort of database software, it's important to understand that validation is critical for that, for any software that you use making decisions or quality related activities for your device and the quality management system as well.
Yeah, I'm not going to go there. I'm going to go right to you and get that Greenlight Guru thing, but and have that in place. But I was just wondering if there's some people out there that try to do it themselves, and do-it-yourselfers. Okay, so I did have the other question, and Basil, you already alluded to this. If I already have a directive compliance system, it sounds like I should really take a fresh look to see if it meets the MDR and not make the assumption that it's just a rubber stamp and it's going to be okay. Is that right?
It's totally true, because you have, it's a new legislation, so you need to first of all do a gap assessment, like you will always do it for any new standard coming out. You're gonna check, am I still in compliance? Have I been overdoing? But the regulation introduces a new principle, a new requirement, new timelines for a lot of processes which were established. So you might not need to scratch everything which you had before and rewrite it from the beginning. You might need to do some updates. In some cases, you might need to create new processes because you didn't have them before. Talk about UDAMET. We didn't have UDAMET before in such a way which has those obligations. We didn't have the obligation on UDI in the past. We didn't have also the PSUR reporting obligation. We didn't have SSCP. So a lot of new aspect which you need to consider as an organization. This means that you need to actually build those processes. Now, you might have those processes for other regions because you have been doing PSUR or SSCP for other countries in the past, but they might not be actually focusing on the European legislation. So at least you need to look to that and make sure that you are addressing the gap. And what I said, and Lisa as well mentioned that before, I always recommend check your status before you start executing, because if you directly move into saying I'm compliant, and that's why I said don't be so arrogant, because everyone can, and this is a principle of quality management system, by the way, continuous improvement. This is why you do quality management system. And continuous improvement means to some extent keeping yourself up to date about current state of the art. And the current state of the art can be the standard change or legislation change, which means you need to keep educating your system and improving your system.
Yeah, so I'm going to move over to the IVDR portion of this question. If we take a look at prior to the IVDR, I think there's a really rough metric that only about 10% of the products needed to have a notified body involved. and now that is flip-flopped. So with all the up classifications, now about 90% of all the IVDs need to have a notified body involvement. And so that means there's a lot more scrutiny on the QMS system that you put in place for the IVD. And there's not a whole lot of precedent in play. So can both of you talk about, the the huge hill that has to be climbed to put QMS in place for the IVDs?
I'll let you start with that one.
Do you want to go first, or it doesn't matter?
I can do that, no worries. So
Okay.
I think the biggest trouble for the IVD manufacturer, the majority of the IVD manufacturers were in the past running as based on their self-declaration. So they haven't been under scrutiny. Now, a lot of them in the past also, the interpretation of self-declaring manufacturer in the past, they believed they didn't need the quality management system. And now with the MDR and the IVDR, both of them, they say for class 1, as well as for self-declared class A devices for IVDs, everyone needs a quality management system. This is an important aspect. So there was a push. Now, the fact that there is this push to have a quality management system is actually clarification of the expectation, because if you have a legislation, you better have a quality management system which allow you to show evidence that you are meeting the requirement. Now, for self-declared devices, there is no notified body certification requirement, but it's highly recommended that you have a certification for at least 13485, which would help you showing that you have an independent review of your quality management system. And some authorities in the European Union will be looking for that. Now, what is the challenge for the IVD manufacturer? If you haven't been scrutinized in the past, even if you had a quality management system, you might not be actually undergoing this continuous check and improvement from a second eye, which is looking to your system. So you have been actually running under your system and believing that you are doing all in a correct way. Now, when you get an independent review, every one of us know when you have someone looking to your work, they might identify aspect which requires improvement. And this is actually the biggest challenge for a lot of IVD manufacturers. Now, on top of this, they haven't been dealing with notified bodies in the past as well. And this is a big challenge for IVD business, because they were having documentation, not just quality management system, but documentation in a format which is not really in line with document control principle of a quality management system. And this is like starting from scratch. So I always say medical devices is far behind where pharma is. If we look now to IVDs, is far behind where MDs are. So the IVD business, I see them like where medical devices were in the early 2000s, and this is where we see now them. So they are far now. It's not a statement that you can apply to all IVD manufacturers, because some operation IVD have been running always globally and they have been scrutinized. But a big portion of that business was actually mid-size, small manufacturer, where they haven't been actually acting in such a level of quality management principles, and they need to educate the resources, their company, about the obligation, and this costs a lot of efforts. And we remember this, all of us, during the COVID time, because we saw all of these COVID tests and COVID measures, which showed actually that those industries do not know the principle of the quality management system, which is already established nowadays. And therefore, it's not wrong. They need to educate themselves, they need to develop themselves, and this takes time till they get actually that knowledge and develop themselves toward the future.
Yeah, and I think the same principle applies, of course. If you haven't really exercised that QMS and been involved with the notified body, it's a great thing to do a gap analysis to fill those gaps and to make sure that you use the system and do an audit before you come to engage with the notified body.
Yeah. So it probably will develop or discover a lot more gaps because there's not been a whole lot of a precedent in the past. All right, so really good answers for that. I know we spent a lot of time on number one, but a really good conversation. I think this question in number two is going to be a little bit more straightforward. So we have talked about the ISO 13485 standard, and I just put this question down here. Is it accepted? Is it recommended? Is it frequently used, or is it required? So what are the situation with 13485 and the QMS for Europe?
So I will start and give the word as well to Lisa. So ISO 13485, like I said, like every standard, is not a requirement. Now, the requirement comes from the legislation. The legislation expects us to have actually state-of-the-art consideration, and it refers to harmonized standard. Now, harmonized standard are actually below common. So we have regulation, we have common specification, then we have harmonized standard, then we have ISO standard, and so on. So if you are as a manufacturer not using ISO 13485, you can apply for an MDR certification without ISO 13485. But the principle of auditing will be according to 13485 because this is how the notified bodies gonna be doing the audit. So it's not recommended that you avoid it. And on top to this, you need to consider your global strategy. Some markets which rely on CE marking, they expect you to have an ISO 13485 certificate as well. So it's not that it's a requirement, but it is the current state of the art. So you should be using 13485 to show evidence of compliance to the MDR. Because if you are not doing that, you will be audited according to the same principle even so. So it's better to have double certification, which will be starting with ISO. If you are a new company, you start with ISO, you prepare your company, you educate your company, and then you ramp it up towards the MDR. Then you will be much on a better pathway than actually just saying, I build a system without referring to ISO, because I would need them to justify that my methodology is actually state of the art, whereas ISO is deemed as the state of the art, and due to the harmonization, it's a recognized standard in the European Union.
Yeah, and I think it really lays the groundwork for the tools that you use to prepare yourself, and making sure that you have at minimum all of those requirements in place, and then layering on top the additional requirements based on the classification of your device in the regulation.
Are there any conflicts between what 13485 would have in place versus the wording inside MDR or IVDR?
I mean, conflicts, this is why the harmonization is a very helpful document. So if you would purchase the harmonized ISO 13485 and you look to the ISO Annex Z, then there is actually a reflection between MDR, IVDR requirement and the requirement of the standard, which shows you which part of the standard can be used to address which article of the medical device regulation or IVDR. And this would help you understanding if there is something which is not addressed by the standard. And this is what is not addressed, need to be closed by your own organization. And this is going back to what Lisa mentioned, the planning phase, where you need to prepare yourself, check actually your readiness, and understand what do I still need to prepare, which is a gap from my current compliance system according to the old legislation or old standards.
Yep. Okay. Very good. So looks like there is some high harmonization between the requirements in MDR, IVDR, and 13485. Okay. So let's move over to the next question here. And we talked a little bit, and I heard some discussion about a gap analysis. That certainly is very helpful, but there's also something that can be done before you actually invite the notified body to your front door and invite them in to take a look. You could do something called an internal QMS audit. And I know both of you are familiar with that. Let's start off with Basil. What are your comments about making this most effective so I can discover some gaps or some issues with my internal audit before the notified body personnel shows up?
Honestly speaking, I always say, identifying your own issues by yourself, building a quality plan to address it is actually the principle of a good quality management system. Because if you don't control your quality management system by yourself, you will be actually getting under a challenge by an independent party who can identify that you implemented something, you never checked its effectiveness. So you need to do that internal audit. And even if you identify an internal audit a reason to believe that you are not compliant, you can build a plan and show that you are addressing actually that non-compliance by a valid measure then the notified body auditor will be happy with you, because they would say, you identified, great, you have a plan, I follow it, and then I can actually support that plan as an auditor. If you would not do that, I would question your quality management system. I can tell you in a lot of quality management audit, according to MDR, IVDR, manufacturers reach out to me and said, like, the notified body asked us during the audit at the beginning, how did you check your readiness before you apply to us? How did you train your team before you apply to us? And then they start, oh my God, we didn't do that. Can you do quickly a readiness check? Can you do an internal audit for us? Because we didn't do that by ourselves. And this is too late, because if you have an audit end of the week and you do an internal audit then beginning of the week, then the notified body might be not really convinced about your quality management system. Same thing, you can't say, I didn't train my team before they do an assessment of the gap. They just got onto the gap assessment, they are not trained, they have no education about MDR, IVDR, they don't understand it, and then you tell them those are the people who are actually ready to show compliance. You need to do your relevant steps, you need to let the people educate themselves, but also offer them a kind of education, and also education after adoption of a change to keep them aware about the new processes. People forget actually that you need to train your people about revised processes before the processes are starting to be effective, because if not, then people will question, how did those people get informed about the changes, how they are aware what they have to do according to the new legislation, especially that we have two legislation running in parallel, or we had it in parallel for many years, and now we are still having additional changes, which might impact the way how you're going to be proceeding and fulfilling the requirements.
I love that. And I think training is important, but also demonstrating the competencies and having documentation, rationale for the people doing the audit. It's always important to have someone that is independent of the activities going on in the QMS, so that they are making clear judgments and giving a good assessment to the team with feedback for improvements. I think that's very important to have that external training for someone that's doing auditing, and to have the independence as well.
Yeah, I think sometimes you pull someone from the regulatory department and they're way too close to the material and the system, and they make assumptions. So it's better to have an independent, more independent party, I think is what you alluded to, be involved in that internal audit, so that they don't gloss over some things that everyone kind of assumes and has been working with for weeks and weeks, and they just kind of assume it. But you have an independent set of eyes as part of that internal audit, and that's the way the notified body is going to be looking at it.
Yeah, and I think as much as everyone would love to assume that your internal folks will have great integrity, an external person also gives a new perspective, and someone with MDR experience, someone with a good amount of med device experience would be what I would recommend in terms of who you might look for to be an auditor.
And
all
I
right,
would say
so
something additional.
go ahead.
Just let me add one point. The internal audit is an important measure that you have to do to check compliance. But also, what I would recommend, review your system with two different actually perspectives: the perspective of compliance and the perspective of being lean. A lot of organizations are overcomplicating their system because they believe with that system they are meeting the requirement of the MDR and IVDR, because they heard it somewhere in some presentation. A requirement is set, actually, the law in Europe gives us the frame, and within that frame we need to define how we're going to meet the requirement. If you overcomplicate yourself and then afterwards you cannot meet it, then it's your punishment. It's not the notified bodies that is overdoing, or the certification organization that is overdoing. They're going to check your system with regard to what you stated. If the law is not stating that you have to do that, and you are defining that by process that you want to do it in such a way, and then you don't meet what you have defined, you cannot come afterwards as a notified body or certification organization saying, yeah, but it's not the law. They audit you according to the methodologies that you have adopted to fulfill the requirements. So make sure whenever you define the pathway that you're going to be following to meet the requirement, challenge yourself, look to options, look to your options first, decide which option is compliant, but it is also doable by me. It's not a process which I see a lot of organizations that they acquire the process from somewhere and they cannot meet it because they don't even have the resources. They didn't even read it, that in that process there are personnel which are not established in their company, and then they get audited and the auditor will ask them, who is that person? And they would say, we don't have that person in our org chart. And they define it because someone complicated the system. So make sure that the system that you're going to adopt is actually a system which you can fulfill, that you can meet afterwards. This would make it much more easier for you.
Yeah, and I think whether if you're new to the industry and you're buying a template package, just don't assume that it's fully ready for you. You're going to need to review those documents holistically, and also in the process of the audit, test that the processes are interacting appropriately with each other to provide the feedback loop that you need to maintain that continuous improvement as well.
Those sounds like some really good guidelines going forward. And actually, I want to explore that a little bit more with this next question. Lisa, let's start with you on this one about non-conforming situations. So over the years, you probably have heard people implement and then go through a review, a conformity assessment, and then there's some issues. Do you have some examples of those that you remember? And how were they discovered? First of all, how were they discovered, and then how were they corrected?
Well, I think a big non-conforming situation that frequently occurs is doing gap assessments in general, and making sure, like as Dr. Akra has mentioned, being state of the art, not only with the 1345 standard, but all the technical standards that you need to have alignment with for the safety and performance requirements, and making sure that your risk management system is compliant and state of the art. I think that it can be frequent where people are not up to date on the most current standards, and then that's where a lot of gaps can be found. Another area is corrective actions. Having repeat nonconformities that trigger in the system because you're not actually getting to the root cause and addressing it appropriately. Those are kind of the biggest things that I've seen in my experience in terms of findings. And the most.
Would add any of those situations, Basil?
I think you can have a long list of situations where there are non-conformities, and what we see. The biggest topic, which is since I started working in RA QA at that time at the notified body, as well as now in my consultancy work, is CAPA. CAPA is the biggest topic that no one is able to set in a system in a way which is continuously compliant. This is the problem which most of the organizations are dealing with. But to go back to your question is how they are best corrected. You know what is the biggest problem with what I see with non-conformities? Non-conformities doesn't mean, first of all, disaster. It means there is a potential for improvement. This is how I see it always. Someone identified something which could be, first of all, you have to check, is it valid? Yes or no? And you cannot check it afterward. You need to check it during the audit and make it clear. If it's valid, then it's a potential for improvement. And then you need to make sure that you read clearly what was written. What I see was a lot of actually back and forth discussion. No one is reading. So it becomes actually a very complex situation, because out of the reply, you get a new nonconformity because you are not able actually to address the nonconformity in a systematic and clear way. So first of all, read the nonconformity, understand the reason for it, check why it happened, make sure that you have actually a measure which is enabling you to address it systematically long term. Don't always look to immediate correction. Immediate correction is one activity, but you need to look to systematic approach for long term actually prevention of this situation happening again. A lot of people correct, and then the next audit it is showing up again because they didn't consider the reason for it in the right way, and they get into that situation. There is this 5 why principle. There are other principles which you need to ask and apply by yourself to make sure that your quality management system is addressing the issue in the right way. And non-conformity list with regard to MDR, IVDR, typically is gap assessment, training, people are management commitment with regard to resources. This is also an additional point. Financial coverage of the company. They forgot that there is a requirement that they have to have an insurance, and they have to have an insurance which is actually addressing the number of product, risk connected to it, and so on. Other nonconformities are related to PRRC, which is a new function which is defined by the MDR and IVDR. People are selecting people without considering what are the obligation on competency, on training and qualification, and also on integration in the system. So people allocate a person, but they do not integrate that person in the quality management system. This is questionable because then you have a person which is a nice plant in your room, but doesn't have any abilities and responsibilities. Doesn't make sense. So there is a long list. I can spend the whole day telling you about that. I think what is important is, like what we said before, read, understand, plan, and implement. And this is actually going back to plan, check, act. So principle. So a plan, do, check, act principle, which gonna help you actually checking continuously that you are in compliance.
Yep, very good. So we don't have all day, unfortunately, Basel. Would like to extend that, but we're going to move on to the last question for the panel that we had put together here. What are some special QMS scenarios that may be encountered? So some of the examples here might be you have the QMS being authored and maintained at a remote site. Unfortunately, it's not at the same site as the manufacturing. So there's a little bit of a disconnect in the communication and visibility. So that might be one scenario. Or you might have another situation where a company has been acquired and now you have two different QMS systems and you're trying to merge them. So let's start with Lisa. Have you seen any of these scenarios or other ones that you would like to highlight?
I don't have any specific experience with those examples. I think that if you're merging, if you have a new acquisition and you are working under two QMSs, I think if you need to bring those together under the same certificate, you're going to need to build the quality manual to be whole for the two companies. And then if there are variances in the procedures after that, they'll have to be documented, at the SOP or work instruction level but overall you would want to harmonize that to the best of your ability.
Yeah. Very good. So, Basel, do you have any quick scenarios that you want to highlight?
I mean, quality management system means actually I have clearly defined criteria. So it means that I have a system in place which is readable for anyone who's coming from outside and understand if I have one or more companies, if I have one or more subsidiaries, if I have one or more production site, how they are interlinked and connected to each other. And what I always define is duties and responsibilities. This is how the structure should be set. And if you define it in the right way, you can have a very complex structure. No worries. You will be compliant, but you need to make sure that that system is actually under continuous control. And this is the trouble which happens every time. But it is not something that's not doable. It's doable. Just make sure that you map your processes. You make sure that your processes are talking to each other, regardless of how big is your company, how complex is your structure. You can make it happen.
Yep. Okay, very good. Angela, I think you have a poll question lined up for the audience, and why don't we go ahead and run that right now?
We do. So if folks want to play along on the screen, what best describes your preparation for the medical device legacy deadline on May 26th? So coming up soon. You have regulation compliant QMS already, or you've applied for notified body conformity assessment. You've signed an agreement with the designated notified body in the EU. You're already undergoing conformity assessment, or you're waiting for a better regulation. You're in trouble. So I see folks are clicking on their selections. All right, and we'll give it a second or two. We'll close the poll and share it. And there's our results. So 68% are regulation compliant with their QMS, great. But quite a split there. 42% have applied for the notified body conformity assessment, 53 have signed, and 32% are undergoing. Nobody's in trouble, that's good.
That's very good.
Yeah, I thought that was really good news. No one is ignoring the responsibilities that they have and getting way behind the 8 ball here and working out, you know, a solution for this. Okay. This now moves our session over to the live Q&A. So Angela, I think you have been watching any of the questions that might have been coming in, and we'll just open that up to the floor as you see fit. You know, pick some of those questions.
Okay.
And
Yep.
panel, we'll rely on Lisa and Basil to come up with some good answers.
Yep, and I know they will. This has been really in-depth. I've wanted us to tackle this QMS topic for a long time, so I'm so glad that we have our panelists here. First question we have, it's about MDR Article 10, Paragraph 9. It defines some QMS elements: strategy, safety, and performance requirements, risk, clinical evaluation, and so on. Of these, which ones are problematic and need special attention?
I mean, the MDR is not telling us something completely new. What is actually problematic is actually not having the risk management as a continuous process and not meeting the risk management principles which are stipulated in the applicable standard and harmonized standard. Also here we have a harmonized standard 4971, which is also giving us a clear guidance on the state-of-the-art interpretation, with a plus from the MDR or from the IVDR, which you need to consider, because like I said, harmonization doesn't mean the replacement of the legislation, but it's actually connection to the legislation and recognition by the legislation. The other troublemaker, which is where everyone is crying because it's costly and time consuming, is the clinical piece. The clinical piece is actually where the MDR limited some of the equivalency approach in the past, where a lot of manufacturers were trying to compare apples with oranges, and now with the MDR, they are required to have their own evidence. This is where manufacturers are actually facing challenges to be able to meet that. And finally, the continuous process, which is coming from Annex 3 and the various articles on post-market surveillance, which is talking about active and systematic post-market surveillance, which is not just the complaints management. This is actually the biggest troublemaker for a lot of manufacturers. Now, what I can stipulate and add to it as well is the fact that for some devices, cybersecurity might be a troublemaker. For some other devices, material composition might be also a troublemaker out of the MDR. So those are actually, if you want to ask which process is relevant, it depends on your device. And I'm not answering it depends because I worked in the past for the notified body, but it is reality. It depends on the risk of class that you are dealing with, the preparation level that you had in the past, and your compliant commitments that you had actually as an organization. And if you are doing what Lisa explained to us, meeting state of the art on a regular basis, then the MDR should not be painful for you. If you have been actually missing some aspect and you didn't do your update on a regular basis, then you will be in trouble regardless of the MDR.
All right, very well, great. Here's another question about any recommendations when interacting with the notified body conformity assessment team?
I think communication is very important here. If they are asking for documentation and preparation for that assessment, and you don't understand what they are expecting, certainly reach out, communicate, over communicate, and make sure that you have a clear understanding of what their expectations are in terms of delivering the preparation documentation, in terms of signing contracts, scheduling, and of course, when it comes down to it, the technical documentation and submitting that appropriately.
All right, and here's kind of a follow-on question to that about how long it might take to do a QMS conformity assessment.
I mean, you don't do a QMS, conformity assessment, you do actually conformity assessment for your type of device, which gonna include a quality management system auditing. So it depends on the risk class of your device. Like Gary mentioned, we have multiple conformity assessment routes, which are connected to your classes. So if you have a class 1 R, M, or S, you would need actually quality assurance with the focus on the reusability, the sterility, or the measurement. 2A to B will be a quality management system with regard based on sampling process. Class 3, full quality management system plus full technical documentation assessment. And if we take it from that perspective, again, it depends on your notified body selection. The law says that the notified body need to define their schedule, their timeline. But I can tell you from current experience, 2A to B devices, class 1 devices, minimum 12 months. If you go to higher class, minimum 18 months to 24 months. This is what you need to consider. And I'm referring here from application to certification decision, which cannot be guaranteed as a positive conclusion. It depends as well on your data, on your quality management system, and your readiness.
All right, very well. And let's take at least one more question. What are the considerations if my QMS needs to support multiple regions, such as the EU and the US? What is the impact of US FDA moving toward ISO 13485?
I think
you want to take it. Go ahead.
I mean, that move is definitely the intention to harmonize with the standard, you know, so it's really aligning things that you already should be doing anyhow across the board. And so I think that will help you be more successful in managing the systems, and making sure that they have alignment will just make it easier in either process.
I mean, it was already with the introduction of medical device single audit program that FDA and ISO started to harmonize, because at the end, if you look to the content and the principle introduced there, they are not that different to ISO 13485. So we have actually already on a quality management level recognition by various countries about actually the usage of ISO. Some countries might have special additional expectations. The same thing with harmonization of ISO in Europe. You have always additional requirements which you need to meet. But if you use the ISO as the baseline, you would be in a better situation than coming in with nothing and starting to scratch everything from the beginning and trying to argue why your system is the best system to address the requirement.
Lisa, I did have a question on that. It just while we were talking about that, it came to mind. Do you find that some of your clients have dedicated SOPs for a region? So maybe they have a couple dedicated for the US FDA, and now they need to write similar, but a little bit different for the EU or another region? Or is it always that it's fully harmonized?
My recommendation, like for example, in considering requirements for reporting to regulatory authorities, would be to have one procedure that maybe has sections for what reporting requirements and determinations you need to make for the FDA versus the EU. That way it's kind of all in a centralized procedure. And then you can have decision trees in an appendix. But I think that it helps keep things clean in terms of the QMS, just as one example.
And then one other quick question just came to mind. Now that UK has broken off and Brexit has occurred a couple of years now, what are you seeing in the QMS requirements for MHRA in the UK?
Before stepping out, Gary, because I have to jump to a notified body meeting, give me a second to say UK is still a black box. So, and there is no additional expectation. UK is still actually recognizing the European law with some special additions with regard to authorized representative and some additional points which need to be discussed how the UK in the future will be. The same thing for Switzerland. So all of that might be leading one day to a recognition of the European law again, or the US FDA. There is a lot of discussion there, but nothing really special for the UK, where you need to build a quality management system for the UK in a different way than the principle of MDR or 13485. I would like to thank everyone from my side, because I have to go to another meeting, and I was happy to have a discussion with you. I will leave you continuing the discussion in case there is any further questions. I think we have a follow-up third round of our ongoing virtual event. Happy to be part of this. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Gary. Thank you,
Dr. Basil.
Thank you so much, Dr. Basil. ACRA is the ACRA team has a couple slides here right here at the end. I'll just summarize for Basil. They provide wonderful and very deep subject matter expert consulting. They're able to do the auditing, and as necessary, they can do that technical writing, medical writing, and so on. And then the other highlighted point here is training. We've heard a lot of good information from Dr. ACRA, and we thank you, or thank him that he's able to provide those services. Before we close out, why don't I move over to the summary for Greenlight Guru? Lisa, do you just want to give us a recap of some of the services that you provide and the products you offer?
Yes. Over here at Greenlight, our focus is on moving medtech forward. Our solutions are designed to help streamline your processes so you can navigate the regulatory hurdles and succeed in the market, like we've been discussing. Our medtech suite provides quality management, product development, and clinical data management solutions designed exclusively for medical devices.
Very good. And Angela, I think there's one last slide here that covers the ReadTech offerings.
Yep, here at ReadTech, we've been with the industry pilot for SPL since the beginning in 2014. We've submitted over 750,000 electronic records to the FDA Good ID and over 20,000 to UniMed. That represents about 33% of all the electronic FDA Good ID SPL records. We do support health authorities in US, EU, China, Korea, Australia, UDI databases coming on board. We have served small companies to the very largest, and our solution does allow for flexible role assignments for in-country representatives and also corporate users. Just a few of our industry associations. We want to thank our panelists today. Very insightful discussion. Lisa Van Ryn, thank you so much. We always love working with Greenlight Guru, and of course, Dr. Basil Akra of the Akra team. We will send folks the contact information and confirmation of your registration and participation. Thank you so much, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.